All right, welcome back to our next session of Ezra-Nehemiah, and we come to Ezra chapter 8. I just want to highlight, because of time, chapter 8 gives us the immediate outworking of the decree that Artaxerxes had given to Ezra. And it begins in Babylon with arrangements being made to return to Jerusalem. Much like chapter 2, after the decree of Cyrus, the proclamation of that decree, in chapter 8, verses 1 to 14, we have a list of the individuals that return with Ezra, at least prepare to return. Because in verse 15, as he assembled those that willingly were going to go with him to Jerusalem, they come to a river that runs to Avia, probably a canal of the Euphrates, and they camp there for 3 days. And notice Ezra says, "And I observed the people and the priests and did not find any Levites." I have people who want to go back. I have priests who want to go back. And I'm going back to have the temple function more in a way that God has ordained and is presently taking place. It was already seen in the decree. There are temple procedures that Ezra is going to be involved in, and provisions. And for the temple to operate smoothly in accordance with God's plan and purpose, there needs to be Levites to help the priests in their priestly ministry. We've already seen in chapter 2, compared to the priests, very few Levites went originally. And so this is one of the, if we can put it this way, failures that has now gone on for a couple of generations. We would assume that the temple is not being fully functional because the priests lack the manpower to help them. Levites are vital. And even at this point, we're not going to probably have as many Levites as should go. There should be at least a Levite for every priest, maybe 2 Levites for every priest, because of the support that is necessary. And so it's interesting here is Ezra the priest, and he calls a time out because there's no Levites. I'm looking for those who will willingly go. I've got people, I've got priests. I don't have Levites. How can there be an advance in the ministry at the temple without Levites? And so in verse 16, I sent for Eleazar, Ariel, etc., and sent them, verse 17, to Iddo, to the leading men of the palace at Cassiphia, and told them what to say to Iddo and his brothers, the temple servants, that is to bring ministers to us for the house of our God. I'm concerned about the temple, and that means I'm concerned about having the proper men serving in the temple, and they have not willingly come forward. And again, the echo of chapter 2, and there's not enough already in Jerusalem to satisfy the need either. It's important enough for Ezra to have the God-ordained men for temple service that he is willing to take this time out and not just see who's going to willingly come, but basically almost implore and get some men to be sent who are Levites. Notice once again verse 18, according to the good hand of our God upon us, they brought us a man of insight, of the sons of Mahal, the son of Levi, the son of Israel, namely Sherebiah, his sons, brothers, etc., along with the temple servants in verse 20. Notice how Ezra sees the provision of these Levites and temple servants that were willing to come. as once again evidence of God's sovereign direction upon his return. Because this is necessary, this is vital for the ongoing of the ministry at the temple.
Just a quick question. On verse 17, idol. Zechariah is from idol. Do you think idol is like the training center for Levites, or like the Levites or something like that?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer. And the question is, what is the Iddo here's relationship to Zechariah, the son of Iddo, the prophet? Zechariah is, again, 3 generations before this. Certainly, names were used generation by generation. So this is not the same Iddo as Zechariah's father. Why is that name? Is that name somehow associated with a training center in Babylon that goes back to Zechariah's father? Possibly so. Do we have enough information to make that conclusion? The answer is no. But it's a good observation, a great observation, and the question. And I can't think of a verse that would solve it off the top of my mind, but that doesn't mean there isn't necessarily one. You ask the question, so sometime when you're reading somewhere else, you might get the answer. So that's why you ask the questions, even though there is no given answer within the text you're looking at. Gentlemen, you are going to become cross-references. You are going to ask questions on a certain passage, and you leave it, and it's going to be months later, and all of a sudden you're reading another passage. There's the clue to help me answer that question that I had 6 months ago on that other passage. So biblical knowledge doesn't come overnight. It's the result of a long, painstaking process. And you got to be committed to that. As expositors, you have to be committed to the fact you're going to be learning for the rest of your life. Gentlemen, I turned 73 in 2 years, and I'm still learning what's in the Bible. And I've been teaching the Bible to people in a seminary level for a quarter of a century, and I'm still learning. And you know what? I'm going to die, and I'm going to go to seminars in heaven and still learn. My joke is during the millennium, I'm going to be going to every seminar on every book and find out, oh, boy, did I blow it on that one. I should have emphasized that. I missed it. So I'm going to be learning. Now, I won't be upset at that point because I'll be sinless. I'll just be growing. But boy, I missed a lot in my pre-resurrection, mind. But all right, but yeah. So there you go. Ask the question because that's the only way you get answers later on. And then, all right, he's got his company that is going back with him. And in verses 21 to 23, then he proclaims a fast. And a fast is to show one's devotion to God, showing one's humility before God, and the fact that one needs God's help. And the reason Ezra needed God's help was because he's embarking on this journey. Verse 23, we fasted and sought our God concerning this, and he listened to our entreaty. So it's prayer and fasting. Fasting showing the humility and dedication. And what was the issue? The issue was we're making this close to 1,000-mile trek. We're going to have, verses 24 and following, valuables, money and valuable things that have been given to us by the king to transport. And we are going to travel on a very dangerous path. And verse 22, I had not asked for any military support from Artaxerxes. Why? Because we had said to the king, the hand of our God is favorably disposed to all those who seek him. But his power and his anger against those who forsake him. I had testified to the king that this was God who had directed and was leading, and it was his call, and he would be the one who would enable the process to come to the God-ordained conclusion. This is all part of his testimony to the king of the greatness of Ezra's God. And the fact that if the hand of God is upon me, then his power and anger will be directed toward those who forsake him. Implication, and his power will be directed to those who follow him. So I've made a testimony of the king, and I have to follow it through now can't go by now and say, I said that God and his power would protect us, and now I'm having second thoughts, so why don't you send me a whole bunch of militia to make sure I get there? He felt it would be a detriment to his testimony to the king, and therefore that's his decision. Now, the motivation is going to be much different when we get to Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah is going to accept the armed forces that will go with him, and a show of force. And, of course, he's going to need it because he's got some very strong opponents that are going to be there when he gets there. And, of course, he's also the other side of the letter of recorded in Ezra chapter 4 of the opponents who've appealed to Artaxerxes to stop the rebuilding of the wall. Now he's going back, and so to have evidence of Artaxerxes' support by the military presence was vital for Nehemiah. Ezra has a different circumstance. He's motivated a different way. Therefore, he makes a different decision. By the way, you notice how godly men can make two very opposite decisions and both be in the will of God based upon the motivation that has led to that decision. So keep that in mind as well. I had dinner last night with a man. One of his famous comments when he was here was, one said, can I do that? He said, well, you might be able to, but I can't. And that is very true at times. Now I'm not going to go there. Because that can create more comments. All right, so, but yes, there are things believers can do that I can't do. And it's not because of biblical command, it's because of wisdom. There are things it's not wise for me to do that other Christians might be able to do because it's not a matter of command, right or wrong. It's what in the situation is most wise. We live in a day and age where we think in terms of law rather than wisdom. As Paul say, all things are lawful, all things are not beneficial. We have lost that. I mean, if it's lawful, I'm going to do it. That's the day and age we live in. The spirit of, if it's lawful, as a Christian, I'm going to do it. No, you got to ask a further question. Not just is it lawful? Is it beneficial? Is it wise? Right, so, and I'm to the age, gentlemen, last night I was in bed by 8:30. Now, I don't make that a command. But at my age, if I'm not in bed by 8:30, I'm not going to be very good at 8:30 the next morning. All right, and that's when I was teaching. So it's beneficial for me to get to bed. And I don't care whether there's a ball game on or the Jeopardy $1 Million Challenge or whatever. Okay, if I'm beneficial for me means being in bed at 8:30. All right, so that's what I mean. I'm not saying everybody else needs to go to bed at that time. I'm just saying that's what's beneficial in my situation to live out the calling God has placed on my life. All right, well, that all came out of, I didn't request troops from the king. It is amazing how you can go biblically from interpreting a verse to seeing its implications to practical application. So hopefully you are seeing that as we go through. Then talking about wisdom, Ezra does a very wise thing. He takes the valuables and he splits his company into 12, interestingly 12, because of 12 tribes of Israel. And he makes and he distributes all the valuables to be carried by different parts of the caravan, with the idea, obviously, if one is held up, then they're not going to get everything. I mean, it's very, very wise, and of course that means that he weighs out and tells you exactly what he weighs out. And then when he gets to Jerusalem, it's all given back again, and sure enough, everything that had been given over into his care by the king reaches Jerusalem safely. So we see the wisdom of Ezra. Now, there is he's a man of Torah. There's nothing in Torah that says, now when you take a long trip that's dangerous, divide the valuables you're taking into 12. There's no command. But in this situation, it was wisdom. It was what was most beneficial for their protection. And of course, by that means, God did provide and brought everything through safely. So on verses 33 to 34, that when they get to Jerusalem, they weigh out the gold, the silver, the utensils, etc. And verse 34, everything was numbered and weighed, and all the weight was recorded at that time. And sure enough, it measured up to exactly what had been distributed previously. So verse 35, the exiles who had come from the captivity offered burnt offerings to the God of Israel. Burnt offerings, again, to show their gratefulness and their renewed dedication to the Lord. 12 bulls for all Israel. Hear the echo of the tribes. 96 rams, 77 lambs, 12 male goats. Now, right away, you've got 12 and multiples of 12s except for the 77 lambs. So, Arista, before you ask the question, I don't have the answer. They had 77 lambs because they had 77 lambs. Why they didn't, drop back to, 72 to make it, well, because they got 5 extra ones, so we'll do it anyway. I don't know, but it's precise, and yet it is, offering burnt offerings to the God of Israel, 12 bulls for all Israel. So again, you can realize why the 12. I mean, the text is clear. That's one representing each tribe, although technically there's 13 tribes, as you know, but 12 became the number. There's a listing, 12 tribes of Israel. You always have to take a look at the list on whether Joseph has been combined or who's been left out. That's how you get 13, because remember, Jacob before he died, Israel before he died, adopted Manasseh and Ephraim, who were sons of Joseph. So there's 13. There's officially 13 tribes. Now, only 12 allotments because Levi had no allotment. And at times you have like the blessing of all 12 and you have the blessing of Joseph, which means Ephraim and Manasseh come under the same blessing. So that's what I said. Anytime you see 12 tribes, you got to, and there's a listing, you got to see how did the text get to 12. But that's the 12 tribes of Israel. So 12 bulls, 96 rams, 12 male goats, all as burnt offerings to the Lord, and 77 lambs. And the 12 male goats are also for a sin offering, as well as being for a burnt offering. And now I won't get into the offerings, how ultimately the burnt offering culminates whatever other offerings have been given. Go back to lectures on Leviticus 1 to 7 for that. And along with that, verse 36, now they deliver the king's edicts to the king's satraps and to the governors beyond the river And they supported the people in the house of God because they couldn't do anything else. Now, these are implied, going back to chapter 4, these are the same government officials who had turned Artaxerxes against the Jews in the past, but now Ezra has in hand the letter with the decree from Artaxerxes commanding the governors of the satrapy, the governor of the satrapy, and the governors of the individual provinces, saying, you are to support what Ezra is doing. And so they supported the people in the house of God. Now, this becomes significant because in chapter 9 and 10, then the opposition to what Ezra is going to do, seek to do, based upon that edict, distinct from chapter 4, which was the enemies, chapter 9 and 10, the problem is going to come from inside the Israelites themselves. The Judeans are the problem. Now, the enemies have been neutralized. And by the way, this is basically Satan's attack against the people of God from the very beginning all the way into the New Testament, even to today. He has a strategy of opposition from outside, and he also opposes the work of God inside. Goes back and forth. See the early chapters of the book of Acts. The opposition from the Sanhedrin, but also then the problems internally. Ananias and Sapphira, the debate over the support of the Hellenistic widows, chapter 6. In other words, gentlemen, that's ministry. And this is what Ezra is finding out, okay? You deal with the external opponents, then you got to deal with internal issues. Deal with the internal issues, you're back dealing with the external. External, internal. It is a never-ending battle. So I can tell you right now, all of your problems in ministry are either going to come from outside your ministry or inside your ministry. And I know that insight will pay great dividends because you're right. Every problem comes either externally or internally. And once one is neutralized, it rises up in the other place. That is dealt with. You're back and forth. That's Satan's strategy against God's work. Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside. So outside is neutralized. The governors support the people in the house of God. That prepares us for chapter 9 and 10. The internal problem that Ezra faces. 9:1, now when these things have been completed, right? So he's returned to Jerusalem. The edict has been passed on. The external threat has been neutralized. All these things have been completed. The princes would be the leaders of the people, approached me saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands according to their abominations of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. Right. Most of these peoples were no longer a problem in Ezra's day. They're quoting, obviously, from the Torah because these were the enemies of Israel 1,000 years previously. And those pagan adversaries 1,000 years previously, God had commanded, Deuteronomy chapter 7, particularly the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, don't marry them. And there's a reason for that. Don't intermarry with them because then you enter into covenant with them. And they will ensnare you with their gods. Rather, you are to go into the land and you are to destroy all the religious paraphernalia that it might not tempt you to desert Yahweh and turn and embrace other gods. So you have to realize from Deuteronomy chapter 7, the whole concept of intermarriage with these pagan peoples, the reason God said no was to keep the people from falling into idolatry. And of course, idolatry had been the great sin that had led to the exile. Now they have returned, and why these are listed is because these are the people reflecting upon Torah. God said not to intermarry with pagans. And why do they bring this up? For they, that is the people, had taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons, so that, and it's important, the holy seed, and that word seed is a reminder of the Abrahamic covenant. As the stars of the heaven, as the sand of the seashore, so shall your seed be. So, seed echoes back to Abraham. And in Ezra-Nehemiah, Abraham is the predominant covenant. We said there's really no emphasis on the Davidic covenant, but the Abrahamic covenant. And so this is the seed, the holy seed, the set-apart seed, based upon God's covenant with Abraham, has intermingled with the peoples of the land. Indeed, the hands of the princes and rulers has been foremost in this unfaithfulness. And that's going to be seen in chapter 10. From the high priestly family on down, this virus had infected the people. And their representatives from every level of the Israelite society at this point in probably early 457 BC that are part, well, this 458 BC when this is taking place is going to be resolved in the early months of 457 BC in chapter 10. It's infected, not all, but it's infected every level of Israelite society. I could put it this way, there probably wasn't a single family in Yehud at this point that was in some way related to somebody that had fallen into this sin. So you might not be personally involved, but someone in your extended family is. That's how greatly this sin had infected, this practice had infected the people.
In verse 1 when it says, according to their abominations, is implying that there was more sin going on than just intermarriage? Like
No, the abominations would be the idolatry and everything associated with the idolatry. So they have now separated themselves from the people of the lands according to their abominations of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites. The intermarriage has led to the beginning of the practice of idolatry and the associated abominations that go with it. So the abominable practice is the renouncing of Yahweh, or turning away. And at this point, it's Solomonic, half-heartedness. They're still embracing Yahweh. They're still going to the temple. But along with that, they're also, because of the intermarriage, they're also embracing these foreign gods of their spouses as well. Predominantly men with women. So it's men taking wives or giving their sons, to have wives who are pagan. Now, going back to chapter 6, there's no problem as long as the foreign woman has converted to Yahweh. She's wholeheartedly a follower of Yahweh, because that's not going to bring in religious syncretism. But you got to realize the Bible makes it very, very clear. Half-hearted worship of Yahweh is counted as idolatry. Solomon was an idolater. That's going to be brought up in Nehemiah chapter 13. Now, nothing in the text ever says of Kings, and Chronicles doesn't even bring it up, but Kings does not say that he ever he didn't renounce his worship of Yahweh as God. What he did was add the other gods to his worship of Yahweh, which is a very common practice in the ancient Near East. It wasn't ancient, was a practice. So in other words, in the ancient, well, we talked about with Cyrus. Okay, every nation that I've conquered, their God is now part of the pantheon of my gods. I just add another God to the mix, another God to my worship. Israel's God is the only true God, and to add a God means he is no longer exclusive. You are no longer worshiping the Lord in spirit and truth. You are no longer wholeheartedly embracing Yahweh. You can say, I only give 5% of my time, 5% of my money, 5% of my, to serve another God. As far as the Old Testament is concerned, as far as the Bible is concerned, that is idolatry. Because the true God doesn't get 95%, the true God gets 100%. And you depreciate that at all, and you have violated, you shall have no other gods in preference to me. That's one of the 10 words. That's the foundation, the essential 10 words. You shall have no other gods in preference. That is the foundational commandment given to Israel. And if you disobey the foundation, everything else is going to follow right along. Yeah.
I mean, it's that time again. I think you also said yesterday that Israel never returned to idolatry because of the devastation of Babylon. So is this a different kind of idolatry compared to what happened with Exodus? Or how do we?
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna answer. That's a good question. Israel renounced idolatry in the exile. They did. That's what we saw yesterday in particularly Ezra chapter 3. That the people who returned were wholeheartedly dedicated to Yahweh and to obeying what Yahweh had said. I'm going to put it this way. This was now their standard. But what we're seeing in chapter 9, because I think if we could resurrect, these individuals, is the fact that, I never renounced Yahweh as the true God. What I have done is like Solomon. I have never renounced. I have added other gods. Whereas Jeremiah 2, what you have pre-exilic in first Israel and then Judah, is a wholehearted rejection of Yahweh, an embrace of other gods. They have rejected me, the fountain of living waters for cisterns that do not hold water. Jeremiah chapter 2. So Jeremiah is talking about the fact there's been a turn from Yahweh and a complete embrace of idolatry. And by the way, Ezekiel shows more of the syncretism. In chapter 8, when he has the temple vision, that's more syncretism. But interestingly, the priests, even though they're in the temple, their back is to the altar, and they're embracing, the abominable idols, and they're pointing east instead of west. Remember, everything in the Old Testament flowed west in the cult. And so the priest, from his entering the temple, tabernacle, and then temple, all the way into the holy place, is going from east to west. His back is against the rising of the sun. Because everything else in the ancient Near East was oriented toward the east, because that's the rising of the sun. And so, and I think that imagery is there with Jeremiah. They have, and seen in Ezekiel, they have turned their back on Yahweh and embraced the idol as the predominant God. I think at this point what you would have in Ezra chapter 9 is, intellectually, I still say Yahweh is the one and supreme God. Like Solomon, I have not completely turned my back upon God and completely embraced an idol. But I have become syncretistic, like, get along with the ancient Near East, that, okay, now I have, along with Yahweh, I have these gods. And so they have not separated themselves from people of the lands, and most importantly, from their gods. And so that's the way I would explain it. That, yeah, if they took a Gallup poll, still 100% of the people in Judah would say, yeah, Yahweh is the true God. I accept that as reality. Well, what about the God of your wife? Well, I love my wife, and so I will participate with her as well. But I understand this is a lesser God, and I should not fully embrace that lesser God. Okay, does that help? All right. And let's face it, gentlemen, let's move to obviously implications this side of the cross. I mean, we still have the same issue today. None of us as Christians will, well, I shouldn't say that, because we do have apostasy, obviously, in the New Testament. There are those who do renounce Christ and embrace the Antichrist, the against Christ. But the more subtle problem still is, I want Christ, but I also want this alongside of Christ as well. The parachrist, rather the Antichrist. And you're going to, I think, see that in ministry. Your problem is not going to be people saying, I renounce the faith. It's going to be people who say, okay, I can hold my faith in Christ and add this, and this, whatever it might be. So that's the way I would, understand it here. Intellectually, yeah, we understand God judges because of our idolatry, because of that wholehearted turning away from Yahweh, refusal to hear his voice, to respond to his prophets, etc. We're not going to go that far, but we do love our wives, and we're going to give some credence, some credibility to serving their gods, which is going to lead to abomination. You will become like the God you serve, and that is a sad reality. So this is the issue. The first two verses give us the issue, and we see in verses 3 and 4, we see the immediate response of Ezra. When I heard this matter, I tore my garment, my robe, pulled out some of my hair from my head, my beard, and sat down appalled. And obviously, the tearing of the robe, the garment, the pulling of the hair, and putting ashes upon one's head, etc. All of these are signs of shame and humility before God. Now, Ezra is not personally involved, but he is ashamed personally and humbled by what has taken place. So the verse 4, then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel on account of the unfaithfulness of the exiles gathered to me, and I sat appalled unto the evening offering. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and with that offering, he is also going to then give his prayer. Further statement of his humiliation in verse 5. And then the first great prayer of the book, the first of the 3 great prayers incorporated in the book of Ezra-Nehemiah. So Ezra was grieved and confessed the sins of God's people. And right now I will, because in your notes, if you'll drop down, I guess it's page 17. If you drop down in your notes, there's a schematic that helps you appreciate the prayer of Ezra. And And the essence is there in verse 4 on the account of the unfaithfulness of the exiles. There's a key term. This has shown the fact that the Israelites have broken faith with Yahweh. And this is going to be the essence of Ezra's prayer. Yahweh has been so faithful to us in restoring at least a small remnant back to the land, and we find ourselves reverting to the same practices that led to the expulsion and exile from the land in the first place. So faithfulness. It's going to come back in Nehemiah chapter 9 as well. You have been faithful, we have not. So it is an issue of faithfulness to Yahweh. Yahweh faithful to them, faithful to his promise, faithful to his word. Now notice, that's going to begin in verse 8. Notice verses 6 and 7 as once again we see it the evening offering, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Even with my garment, my robe torn, I fell on my knees, stretched out my hands to the Lord my God, Yahweh my God, and said, and then we have the prayer. So he's still in his humble state, his humble condition, and he gives voice to that shame in verses 6 and 7. Notice how oh my God, I'm ashamed and embarrassed to lift up, oh my God, my face to you. He's using the image, I can't even look you straight in the face. This is so devastating. This is so shameful that all I can do is keep my head bowed. For our iniquities and our guilt, risen above our heads, grown even to the heavens. Since the days of our fathers to this day, we're reduplicating the sins of our fathers. This has been our constant heritage. And by the way, it has been. Ezekiel chapter 20. All the way back to when Israel was in Egypt, they had their idols. They came out of Egypt. They practiced idolatry in the wilderness. They practiced idolatry in the land. This has been the besetting sin of Israel from the fathers to this day. We have been in great guilt on account of our iniquities. Notice iniquities, guilt, iniquities. So see the chiasm that is there. And obviously, the concept is that our actions have produced the state. Our iniquities have brought about our guilt. And notice how inclusive we, our kings, our priests, have been given the hands of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plunder, and to open shame as this day. So we have suffered the consequences of military defeat and material disaster and shame. It has been total. It has been physical. It has been emotional. It has been spiritual. The devastating consequences. So it has been all inclusive from top to bottom within our community, and it's been complete as far as physical, emotional, and spiritual devastation is concerned. Gentlemen, sin has consequences. And as many times been said, that you can make your decisions, but God controls the consequences. And the consequences for sin, devastation, complete, total. Yet in light of that heritage, but now for a brief moment, grace has been shown. Grace has come from Yahweh our God to leave us an escaped remnant, to give us a peg in his holy place. A peg is like a tent nail. In the holy place would be the Holy Land. So it's like we're this remnant that has been able to return. We're like a little peg in the land. That God may enlighten our eyes and grant us a little reviving in our bondage. By the way, notice the bondage has not come to an end. Ezra knows his Old Testament well enough to know this is not the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant anticipated in the Torah. This is not God redeeming his people from the foreign lands and bringing them in toto back into the land, changing their heart and bringing the blessings of the covenant upon them. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 10. But there has been, and Nehemiah is going to go back to some of the same passages in the Torah in his prayer in Nehemiah 1. In fact, there's a continuity between the prayers of the two men. That's another way the author is showing that Nehemiah is not spiritually inferior to Ezra, by the way. I got to give my things to Connie. I love her work, but boy, when she took Nehemiah to task, my righteous anger came to pass. How can you appreciate God's servant that way? But that's a scholarship. For we're slaves. In our bondage, God has not forsaken us, but has extended loyalty to us in the sight of the kings of the Persia. By the way, it's very interesting here. He ties in the decrees of the kings, going back to Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, not just the one he's personally received, but the previous decrees as well, of Israel being allowed to go back to the land as at least a foretaste and evidence of God's loyalty to his covenant promise to Abraham. Right, this is very vital to see, because we live in a day and age where some would try to say, well, the Abrahamic covenant was fulfilled in their return to the land. No, his extended loyalty in the sight of the kings of Persia to grant us some reviving, to raise up the house of our God, to restore its ruins. This is just a small glimmer of God's loyalty to the Abrahamic covenant, which gives to the faithful the assurance that as God has given that little sliver of faithfulness to that promise, that we know that the full is going to come in the future. And so he's allowed us to raise up the house of God, restore its ruins, to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. By the way, that's figurative. It's not saying the wall's already been built. What he's saying there is wall is protection. He's given us protection. That we're still here. The opponents have tried to push us out, and we are still here. That's the good hand of God. That's God's faithfulness. That's God's loyalty to the covenant promise that he has made. Now, what he has certainly done in verses 8 and 9, having spoken about his shame, he then acknowledges God's grace, God's goodness, God's faithfulness. And in verses 10 and following, he then has to acknowledge that in response to this evidence of God's faithfulness, God's loyalty to the Abrahamic covenant, the seed of Abraham has continued to show themselves unfaithful, disloyal. Now, our God, what should we say after this? We've forsaken your commandments, which you command your servants the prophets, saying, the land you've entered to possess is an unclean land with the uncleanness of the people of the lands, with their abominations which have filled it from end to end and with impurity. So now do not give your daughters their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons. and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good things of the land and leave it as an inheritance to your sons forever. God, you made it very, very clear. Right? The commands under the Sinaitic covenant, but the covenant to Israel made through Moses at Sinai. Okay, those commands tie back into the Abrahamic covenant. This is the way we'll be blessed in the land if we're faithful to you as Abraham was, and yet we have not been. And here's the essentials of what we have in a passage like Deuteronomy 7. Exactly why intermarriage should not take place. Because these people are unclean and pure and will lead us astray. We should not seek their peace. Rather, they need to be destroyed. They weren't, and so there are, once again, consequences. And after all has come upon us for our evil deeds, our great guilt, since you are a God have requited less than our iniquities deserve and have given us an escape remnant as this. Even in history, it's only your grace, it's only your faithfulness, the Abrahamic covenant, that's allowed us to remain a seed before you, a holy, set-apart people. You should have annihilated us. Even judgment is tinged with grace. And after all of this, shall we again break your commandments and then marry the peoples who commit these abominations? Would you not be angry with us to the point of destruction until there's no remnant nor any escape? Now, but it's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Because God in the Mosaic covenant, when he talked about the curses and the blessings, because the Abrahamic covenant, Israel would never be completely abolished as a people. There's always going to be the seed of Abraham in a national entity called Israel. It's interesting, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28 say, yeah, the time will come when you will despair of even your existence, but even then I will be with you. They can go through a Holocaust, 6 million Jews being put to death. It can get very small, but there will always be a small group. And here's Ezra. Basically what he's saying is, I know it can't happen. This is like Paul's rhetorical question in a statement in Romans 9. I wish I could be accursed for the sake of my kinsman Israel. Well, that can't happen because he's in Christ. He's secure in Christ. That comes right after. Nothing can separate us. I wish I was accursed. It's a statement that can't happen, but it shows that the depth of understanding on the part of Paul in Romans 9 and here Ezra in Ezra 9. Wow, that's providential. Chapter 9. Would you not be angry with us to the point of destruction? What he's saying is, look, if anyone deserved to be annihilated, we do. There should be no remnant to escape. Israel should be finished. The seed of Abraham physical seed of Abraham should come to naught. Now, it's not going to happen because of God's faithfulness. But that's how desperate, that's how destructive Ezra sees what is taking place. The rhetoric within this question. Would you be angry with us to the point of destruction until there's no remnant nor any who could escape? That's what our sin deserves. Oh Lord God of Israel, you're righteous. I'm glad you uphold your standard. You live by your standard, for we have been left to escape remnants of this day. Behold, we are before you in our guilt, for no one can stand before you because of this. All he can do is just throw himself completely upon the grace and mercy and faithfulness of God. Probably, do you realize there is not, it's called a prayer, but it's no petition. He doesn't ask for anything. This is out and out confession. Now he's praying to God, but verse 10, the people are hearing. He was praying and making confession, weeping, prostrating himself before the house of God. And a very large assembly, men, women, children. Notice spells out, same thing will take place in Nehemiah 8. We know women and children did go along for the ride, as I talked about yesterday in Ezra chapter 2. They're there too. Gathered to him from Israel, for the people wept bitterly. Now, the assumption at this point is these are the people not personally participating in the sin. All have been infected, all have not participated, is the way I would put it. And so there are those led by Shechaniah, son of Jael, one of the sons of Elam, said to Ezra, "We have been unfaithful to our God and have married foreign women from the people of the lands, yet now there is hope for Israel in spite of this." But he got that from the prayer and from Torah. Where's the hope? God is faithful. Ezra, you have just confessed the sin of the people to God. In confession, there is forgiveness and the possibility of restoration. Not because we deserve it, but because of the character of God. So now let's make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and their children according to the counsel of my Lord and those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. The law command is never to do this in the first place. So let's make a covenant that we will obey the law, and by obeying the law, the implication is we have to put away the wives and the children. Implied, who would lead us into idolatry with its associated abominations. And of course, arise, this man is your responsibility. It's upon you. We'll act according to your word. Ezra, of course, responds positively. He is the man of Torah, sees this as in line with what Torah has said. Because going back, the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, etc., should have been put to death. Not the Ammonites or the Moabites, Egyptians, but the Amorites, the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Amorites, all came under the curse. They should have been put to death. There never should have been marriage with them in the first place because they shouldn't have been alive to get married. And so I think that's the perspective on, well, why put these wives away? Because you never should have entered into these marriages in the first place. Let me conclude, and we'll probably take our break, and then we'll come back and how do we apply this to today? What's its implications for today? This is, like I said, the most asked question that you have. Well, they went through, the proclamation is made throughout the land. Okay, oral proclamation, 3 days, gather in Jerusalem. The people as a whole, because the men, verse 9, of Judah, Benjamin assemble in Jerusalem within 3 days. They're confronted by Ezra. Verse 10, you've been unfaithful and married foreign wives, adding to the guilt of Israel. Now therefore make confession to the Lord God of your fathers, do his will, separate yourself from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives. Your continuation as a wholly separate seed of Abraham devoted to Yahweh means putting away women who would lead you astray, lead you away from the total worship of Yahweh. And so the assembly responds, that's right, as you said. It's upon us. We need to do this. And they did it. Now, verse 15, do they oppose? Are these a minority that oppose the solution or oppose the fact that because of the time necessary to adjudicate all the cases, that this will be done locally and over a period probably the next 3 to 4 months? are they against? What decision are they against? Probably most likely against the decision to put away the wives. Because verses 16 on then gives the record of those who did follow the word and put away their wives. And they are listed. By the way, notice it began with the descendants, verse 18, of Jeshua the high priest. So this has infected even the high priestly family, other priestly families, Levitical families, families of the singers, of the assembly of Israel. That's what I said. This through every level of the society was infected by this sin. And so the list ends, verse 44, all these had married foreign wives, and some of them had wives by whom they had children. And that's the reason it had to be put away, implied. I think the MacArthur study note is good on this. It's certainly provision would have been made for them. It wasn't so cold-hearted that they were just cast out. They were cast out, but with obviously the proper means for support. It was disaster in the ancient Near East to be a widow and orphan. So the proper, and the law called for that. The law called for special provision to be made for widows and orphans. So that element of the law, because they're law keeping at this point, must have entered in, even though the text, doesn't explicitly state. So the women and children were taken care of. In some way, we don't know. That's not important to the text. And if this was a singular book, that's the way it ends. What a note. I mean, you talk about the downer in chapter 13 of Nehemiah. It's pretty downer here in Ezra chapter 10. In fact, you get to the end of chapter 10 and you've gotten the pattern of decree, return, initial success, opposition, which is internal opposition at this point. It could bring devastation to what God is doing. When did Ezra have his ultimate success? So you got to go into Nehemiah. If you don't get to Nehemiah 8, you never find Ezra completing the task to which the decree had told him, to teach the people the word of God. So Ezra ends with to be continued. Once again, shows the interlinkage and the linkage as the one book. But before we get to chapter 8, we got to get to the whole problem of, Ezra feared God's judgment, God's discipline. It came. It wasn't annihilation of the people, but it was destruction of the walls and gates that had been built to that point. And so God has to rectify that before Ezra then is allowed to have his teaching ministry in Israel. All right, it says right at 11, so let's go till 11:15. The divorce issue is big enough. We'll take as much time as necessary. We'll just go through Nehemiah a little quicker, that's all. Because this is, Goswell is right. This is the ethical issue of the book. What do we do with divorce? Is this God's plan? If you marry a non-believer, you should divorce her? Is that the application to present-day Christians? The implication for the present-day Christians? Well, we'll talk about that after the break. 15 minutes you got to kind of wrestle with that in your mind. All right? We'll be back at 11:15.
One of the questions that I would be interested in hearing answered would be, like in a missionary situation,